Little did Alina know what was about to happen to her today. Why did Peter do this? And why were people looking at them in shock? Everyone felt sorry for Alina when Peter threw the mug of soup at her. But what happened next will be a heart-touching moment for you. Before we continue, kindly subscribe to the channel. Alina sat at the dining table of a quiet restaurant, her hands gently wrapped around the warm mug of soup in front of her. The steam rose in delicate wisps, but Alina wasn't looking at it. Her mind was far away, tangled in a web of thoughts that refused to let her focus on the present. Her gaze flickered back and forth, now and then drifting to the window, but the unease in her chest would not leave. It wasn't the soup that occupied her thoughts. It was the mounting tension in the air around her. She could feel it pressing down on her, thick like the fog that often settled over the city in the early morning. There was something off, something she couldn't quite pinpoint, but she could sense it all the same. She could hear Peter's footsteps as they echoed in the distance, pacing the room in frustration. Peter Smith, her husband, was a man of many contradictions. To the world, he was calm, composed, and successful, a man who had it all together. But Alina had learned over the years that behind his polished exterior lay an anger that flared at the slightest provocation. And today, it seemed, was no different. She could hear him in the other room, muttering under his breath, his movements erratic. Every few seconds, his voice would rise in frustration, but she couldn't make out the words. It wasn't the first time Peter had been angry, but today felt different, like the anger simmering inside him would boil over at any moment. Alina couldn't help but wonder if this tension had something to do with last night's argument. The words exchanged between them had been sharp, cutting into the very core of their marriage. They'd argued about Mary, Peter's sister, who had once again asked for money. This time, the amount was a staggering $4,600. Alina had refused, as she always did, knowing they could not afford to help her, but Peter had lost it. His temper flared, and the fight escalated quickly, ending with Peter storming out of the house. As the hours ticked by, Alina remained in the same position at the table, her fingers numb from gripping the mug. The silence around her was suffocating. She tried to push the thoughts of Peter's anger away, but they kept coming back. There was an underlying tension in the air that felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. The worst part was that Alina wasn't even sure what she was supposed to do. She had tried everything to keep the peace, to keep Peter happy. She'd tried to be the perfect wife, the one who supported him, who took care of the house, who kept quiet when he made decisions she didn't agree with. But it was never enough. She wasn't enough. The thought made her stomach turn, and she quickly looked down at the soup, trying to hide the tears that were threatening to spill. The hot liquid in the mug seemed almost like a metaphor for her life, something warm and comforting, but ultimately out of reach, like her own peace of mind. Peter's voice suddenly broke through the silence, sharper now, his words unmistakable. "This is ridiculous, Alina," he shouted from the other room. She knew the outburst was directed at her, and her heart sank. The air had gone from tense to volatile in an instant. Something was about to break, and Alina wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming. Peter's anger reached a boiling point that afternoon, and without any warning, he threw the mug of soup at Alina. The hot liquid splashed across her blouse, burning her skin, but it was the emotional pain that struck the hardest. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Tears welled up in Alina's eyes, not just because of the physical pain, but because of the realization that her marriage, her life with Peter, had come to this. Peter didn't love her. He loved money and control, and Alina had become nothing more than an accessory in his world. In that moment, as she wiped the tears from her face, a turning point unfolded. Alina understood that this wasn't just a bad day. This was the culmination of years of mistreatment, and she could no longer accept it. The next few days passed in a haze for Alina, each moment blending into the next as if time had lost its meaning. She walked through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, pretending to be a wife who hadn't just witnessed the unraveling of her marriage. But inside, She felt a storm brewing, a storm she could no longer ignore. The events that had unfolded over the past week weighed heavily on her. The argument with Peter was still fresh in her mind, the sharpness of his words echoing in her ears. He had thrown soup at her, a grotesque act that had broken something inside her. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just dealing with a frustrated husband. She was trapped in a toxic relationship that had eroded her sense of self. Peter's anger had always been there, a shadow lurking in the background, but this was different. This time, the violence wasn't just verbal, it was physical. It wasn't about money or Mary anymore. It was about control, and Peter had made it clear that he saw her as nothing more than an accessory to his life. She was just another problem to be dealt with when he was upset, and he couldn't care less about the emotional toll his actions were taking on her. Elena had spent days pondering her next move, racked with guilt and fear. How could she leave him? What would people think? She had invested so many years in this marriage, so many dreams of a life together. But as each day passed, the realization that her dreams had been shattered became clearer. Peter wasn't the man she had married. He had become someone unrecognizable, and every moment she spent with him felt like a piece of herself was being chipped away. Finally, the decision came not in a moment of clarity, but in a surge of pure necessity. She could no longer pretend. She could no longer sit by and allow herself to be mistreated, to be emotionally beaten down. Elena was tired of living in fear, tired of being small, tired of living for someone else's approval. She thought of Lily, her old friend, who had always been there for her in times of need. Lily had been the one person who had never judged her, who had always seen her potential. When Elena reached out to her, desperate for guidance, Lily listened, truly listened, and reassured her that she was strong enough to leave. With her heart pounding in her chest, Elena called her lawyer, Mr. David, and made the first appointment for a divorce. It felt like the weight of the world was lifting from her shoulders with each word she spoke. She was no longer Peter's wife. She was Elena, a woman with her own life to live, her own dreams to chase. As the phone call ended, she looked around the house that had once felt like a home. It no longer felt like hers, not with Peter's anger lingering in every corner. The decision was made. She wasn't going to be a victim any longer. She was walking away, not just from Peter, but from a life that had never truly belonged to her. And for the first time in a long while, Elena felt a spark of something she had forgotten: hope. Elena stood up, wiped away the tear that had slipped down her cheek, and made her way to the door. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she was free, and that was all that mattered. The day Elena walked into Mr. David's office, the weight of her decision felt both surreal and empowering. It had taken everything within her to make the call, to step forward and claim her right to a life beyond the suffocating grip of her marriage. Now, sitting across from her lawyer, she was ready to begin the process of ending her life with Peter. "Let's start," Mr. David said, his voice calm and reassuring. Elena could see the years of experience in his eyes. This wasn't his first divorce, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. But to her, it was the first time someone was guiding her through the process of reclaiming her autonomy. "Do you have any questions before we proceed?" Mr. David asked. Elena shook her head. Her mind was a whirlwind, and she tried to focus on the task at hand. This was not just a legal step. It was a declaration of her independence. The divorce papers would serve as the physical manifestation of her decision. Each document, a firm line drawn between her old life and the one she was about to build. As Mr. David walked her through the terms of the divorce, Elena's mind flickered back to the night before. Peter had been angrier than ever when she told him she was considering a divorce. He accused her of being selfish, of abandoning their marriage for no reason. He begged, pleaded, and even tried to manipulate her with promises of change, promises that she had heard too many times before. But Elena stood firm. His apologies had lost their meaning. His words were just empty noise now, and she could see right through them. "The first step is the petition," Mr. David explained, handing her a thick stack of paperwork. "We'll file for separation, and then we'll initiate the divorce proceedings. Once it's filed, Peter will have time to respond. After that, the court will schedule a hearing, and then we move forward." The paperwork felt like a small but significant victory. It was the beginning of the end, an end to years of emotional turmoil, to the fear of what Peter would do next. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. Though Elena felt empowered by her decision, the emotional toll was undeniable. She felt a deep sense of loss, not for the marriage, but for the person she had once been. How had she let herself be so lost for so long? In the quiet moments of self-reflection, Elena struggled to come to terms with the years she had spent in silence, living in the shadow of Peter's abuse. She had ignored the warning signs, hoping things would improve, but now she knew better. The truth was clear. She had to rebuild herself from the ground up. As the days passed, Elena began to discover a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. The emotional toll of the divorce was still heavy, but something within her was shifting. She no longer felt like a passive participant in her own life, waiting for things to happen. She was taking charge, one decision at a time. It started with small actions, choosing to get out of bed early, not to wallow in self-pity. She found herself walking longer distances, breathing in the fresh air, reminding herself that life could still be beautiful. Every moment of self-care felt like a reclaiming of power. Her work at the bookstore became her sanctuary. Surrounded by books, she could immerse herself in different worlds, finding solace in the written word. The simple routine of organizing shelves, helping customers, and reading on her lunch breaks offered a quiet peace she hadn't expected. Lily continued to be her lifeline, offering unwavering support. With Lily's encouragement, Elena began to see the glimmer of hope in her future. She started to believe that she could build a life not just for survival, but for thriving. The days of being controlled by Peter's anger were behind her. She had a job, a purpose, and most importantly, she was reclaiming her identity. For the first time in years, Elena looked in the mirror and saw someone worthy of love, not from others, but from herself. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that her strength would guide her. With each passing day, Elena's sense of independence deepened. The initial fear of standing alone had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, powerful realization that she could survive, and even thrive, on her own. She no longer depended on Peter's approval or presence to define her worth. For the first time in years, she was making decisions solely for herself. Her work at the bookstore was more than just a job now. It had become a part of her healing process. The steady rhythm of organizing shelves and recommending books to customers gave her a sense of accomplishment, a reminder that she had control over her life. She began to invest time in learning more, reading books on personal growth and empowerment. Each page she turned felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place, helping her understand her own emotions and how to move forward. But healing wasn't just about physical independence, it was emotional too. Elena began to forgive herself for the years she had spent in a toxic relationship, understanding that her past didn't define her future. The guilt she once carried slowly lifted, replaced by self-compassion. She accepted that she had done her best with the circumstances she was given, and now it was time to move forward. Lily remained a constant source of support, but Elena was no longer the woman she had been when the divorce began. She was stronger, more self-assured, and ready to take on whatever life had to offer. The healing process was slow, but each small step towards independence was a victory. Elena was learning to trust herself again, and in doing so, she was reclaiming the life she deserved. One day, as she sat at a local cafe writing in her journal, Elena realized how far she had come. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She was free to live her life as she saw fit. She had rediscovered who she was, someone who was capable, strong, and worthy of love. She didn't need a man to define her. She had reclaimed her voice, her strength, and her identity. Elena had spent years allowing others to define her, first Peter, and then the expectations of society. But now, she had a blank canvas, and the future stretched out before her. The choice was hers, and she was determined to make the most of it. As she spent more time in the bookstore, she met Alex, a man who admired her strength, her intellect, and her creativity. They became friends, and over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. But this time, Elena wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was already complete. Elena had built a new life from the ground up. She had her own job, her own apartment, and her own dreams. She no longer lived in fear or under anyone's thumb. The woman she had become was powerful, independent, and unapologetically herself. In the end, Elena's story wasn't just about escaping an abusive marriage. It was about reclaiming her identity, her passions, and her right to live life on her own terms. She had learned the value of self-love and the power of never settling for less than she deserved.